There is a version of pain that people fight desperately to escape, and there is another version of pain that people will defend with everything they have, even when it is destroying them, even when a way out is standing right in front of them. Picture someone describing, for the third time this month, exactly how a friend wronged them, exactly how a boss overlooked them, exactly how life has consistently failed to give them what they deserved. Someone finally offers a way forward, a concrete step, a small action that might actually change something. And watch what happens. The suggestion does not land as help. It lands as an accusation. Almost immediately, a new reason arrives for why that solution would not work either. Why this situation is different. Why nothing anyone suggests ever quite applies. This is not stubbornness, and it is not stupidity. Something is being protected here, and it is not the person's circumstances. It is a role, one that, against every appearance, is providing something the person cannot easily give up. We are taught to think of victimhood purely as something that happens to a person, an unwanted fact imposed from the outside. But there is a second, much less discussed layer underneath that. Victimhood as an identity, one that a person can begin without ever choosing to consciously to inhabit, defend, and quietly depend on. Carl Jung wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Clinging to victimhood is one of the most absurd and most common of those avoidances, precisely because it disguises itself as the opposite of avoidance. It looks like confronting what happened. It looks like honesty about being wronged. And it can be all of those things, while also, underneath, becoming a very effective way of never having to face something even harder. The possibility that change is available, and that taking it is now, in fact, up to you. This is not a video accusing anyone of faking their pain. Real harm is real harm. This is about what happens after the harm, about the specific hidden psychological payoff that can make staying inside the identity of victim feel safer than the uncertain, unguaranteed work of stepping out of it. To understand why this identity becomes so difficult to release, you have to look at what it was originally built to do. For a child growing up in a genuinely unsafe or unpredictable environment, recognizing oneself as a victim of circumstances beyond their control is not a distortion. It is an accurate, even necessary piece of self-knowledge. John Bowlby's research into childhood attachment showed that children in chaotic or harmful environments develop very real defenses. An understanding, I did not deserve this, and I am not the cause of this chaos, can be a genuinely protective, even life-saving realization. For a child who might otherwise absorb blame that was never theirs to carry, the difficulty arrives later, when that accurate piece of self-knowledge, I was a victim of this specific situation, quietly calcifies into something broader and far less accurate. I am a victim as a permanent description of who I am, applied to every future situation regardless of the actual facts. Karen Horney's framework offers a precise account of how this shift happens. She described a personality orientation she called moving against people, but there is a subtly variant worth naming here too. A kind of moving through helplessness in which a person manages the terror of an unpredictable world by locating all power outside themselves. If nothing is ever my fault, then nothing is ever fully in my control. But crucially, nothing is ever fully my responsibility either. For a nervous system shaped by real, early helplessness. This can feel less like resignation and more like relief. Sigmund Freud's work on the ego's defenses adds another layer. Freud observed that the mind will construct almost any interpretation of events that protects it from an even more threatening idea. And for many people, the idea that they hold real agency, that some outcomes actually are within their control, is counterintuitively more threatening than powerlessness. Agency means accountability. Agency means that if things do not improve, the reason might eventually have to include you. This is the hidden fork in the road. A child who survives a genuinely victimizing situation and is later met with acknowledgement, support, and eventually an honest return of agency tends to integrate the experience without it consuming their entire identity. But a child whose only reliable source of attention, sympathy, or care arrived specifically when they were suffering learns something quieter and more durable. Being harmed is what makes me visible. Being fine makes me invisible again. That lesson, absorbed early enough, does not need to be conscious to keep operating for decades. Consider two adults, both of whom experienced genuine betrayal in a past relationship. The first person processes the anger, grieves what was lost, and eventually moves toward new connection, carrying the memory but not organizing their entire identity around it. The second person, when introduced to someone new, finds themselves retelling the old betrayal, but within the first few conversations, almost involuntarily, as though the new person needs to be warned, or perhaps as though the retelling itself has become the only way the first person knows how to explain who they are. The difference between these two people is rarely about the severity of what happened to them. It is far more often about what role suffering was assigned in each of their childhoods. Whether pain was one difficult chapter among many, or whether pain was the only chapter that ever reliably earned attention. Here is the part almost no one wants to say out loud, because it sounds cruel, but it is not cruelty. It is mechanism. Staying inside the identity of victim provides real, tangible, psychological rewards. And until those rewards are named honestly, no amount of willpower will loosen the grip. The first reward is moral exemption. If something was done to you, you are automatically, instantly absolved of responsibility for how your life currently looks. This is an extraordinarily comfortable position to occupy, because it removes the single most frightening question a person can ask themselves. What if the reason things have not changed is partly me? The second reward is guaranteed sympathy. Nathaniel Branden observed that human beings have a deep need to be seen and understood. And for someone whose early environment offered attention only during moments of visible suffering, the story of being wronged becomes a remarkably reliable way to generate exactly that. It does not require charm, achievement, or vulnerability of the kind that risks rejection. It only requires the retelling of harm, and the sympathy tends to arrive on schedule. The third reward is moral high ground. There is a quiet, intoxicating clarity to being the wrong party rather than the ambiguous, complicated author of your own outcomes. Horney would recognize this as a defense against the far more disorienting task of holding multiple truths at once. That you are wronged and that you still have choices, that something happened to you and that what happens next is also up to you. This is why offering a practical solution to someone anchored in this identity so often backfires. A solution is not received as help. It is received as a threat to the entire structure. Because if the problem is actually solvable, then continuing to suffer becomes uncomfortably a choice rather than a fate. The identity would rather reject the solution than surrender the certainty, the sympathy, and the exemption that come with staying exactly where it is. Bessel van der Kolk's research adds a physiological layer to this. Chronic victimhood identity often correlates with a nervous system that has learned to associate helplessness with a strange kind of safety. Not comfort, but familiarity. Change, even positive change, activates uncertainty, and an unfamiliar, uncertain future can register in the body as more dangerous than a familiar, painful, but predictable present. Notice how this shows up in something as ordinary as a support group or a close friendship built around shared struggle. There is real, valuable comfort in being understood by people who have suffered something similar. But watch what sometimes happens when one person in that group begins to genuinely improve. Rather than being celebrated without reservation, they can be met with a subtle, almost unconscious coolness, as though their progress has quietly disrupted the shared identity the group was built on. The unspoken rule of some of these spaces becomes, you are welcome here as long as you are still suffering visibly enough to belong. Recovery, paradoxically, can start to feel like betrayal of the very community that helped a person survive in the first place. The cost of this identity rarely feels like a cost while it is being paid. It feels like protection. The bill only becomes visible much later, and by then it has usually grown very large. The first cost is agency itself. Every time a person interprets a new situation exclusively through the lens of what was done to them, they quietly surrender the muscle required to ask what they might do next. That muscle, like any other, weakens with disuse. Over years, a person can lose not just the practice of taking action, but the basic belief that action would even work if attempted. The second cost is relationships, and this one is particularly painful because it happens in reverse of what the person expects. Sympathy, freely given at first, tends to erode with repetition. Simone de Beauvoir wrote about the difference between being seen as a full, complex subject and being reduced to a single fixed role. Friends and family who once offered genuine comfort often begin, over time, to experience quiet exhaustion, followed by distance, followed by an unspoken reluctance to bring up their own struggles at all, since there never seems to be room for anyone else's pain in the conversation. The very sympathy the identity was built to secure eventually becomes the thing it drives away. The third cost is harder to name, and it tends to surface only in isolated, unguarded moments, often triggered by seeing someone else who faced something genuinely comparable move forward in a way that no longer seems available. A quiet, uncomfortable thought can surface. What if I have been choosing this in some way for longer than the original event was ever actually happening? Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about the difference between what happens to us and what we do with what happens to us, insisting that the second half of that equation remains within reach no matter how severe the first half was. For someone who has spent years anchored entirely in the first half, that insight can land less like wisdom and more like an accusation, which is exactly why it is so often rejected the moment it is offered, and exactly why it needs to be heard eventually anyway. The final quiet irony is this: the identity was built originally to protect a person from feeling powerless, but maintained indefinitely, it becomes the very thing that guarantees powerlessness continues long after the original cause of it is gone. There is a particular scene that plays out for many people shaped this way, usually years into the pattern, often triggered by something small. A scroll through old messages, a chance encounter with someone from that earlier chapter of life, who has in the meantime simply moved on. The comparison is not gentle. It arrives with a specific, uninvited thought. They went through something just as hard, and somehow they are not still standing in the same spot I am. The instinct in that moment is often to explain the difference away. They had more support, easier circumstances, better luck. Anything to avoid the far more destabilizing possibility that the primary difference was simply a choice made repeatedly to keep walking rather than to stay. There is often a specific uncomfortable moment when the difference between having been harmed and having built an identity around that harm becomes impossible to keep ignoring. It tends to arrive quietly, often after someone offers help for what feels like the 100th time, and the same old reason for refusing it rises up automatically before any real thought has even occurred. And in that instant, occasionally, a strange, clarifying question breaks through. Would I actually know who I was without this story to tell? That question, once asked honestly, is very hard to unask. Because if the answer is uncertain, if the identity of the wronged one has become so central that its absence feels like disappearance rather than relief, then something has shifted from processing an experience to depending on it. Carl Jung insisted that the unconscious material a person refuses to examine does not go away. It simply continues directing behavior from just outside of awareness, disguised as certainty, and disguised as fate, disguised as simply how things are. Recognizing that the story you have been telling has become the architecture of your entire identity is not the same as saying the original harm did not matter, or did not happen, or did not deserve acknowledgement. It happened. It mattered. But mattering once is not the same as being required to organize an entire life around it forever. The moment someone can finally hold both truths, I was wronged and I am still right now, capable of choosing what happens next, is the moment the identity stops being a fixed prison and starts becoming simply one chapter among many. If any part of this felt uncomfortably familiar, you are not alone in it. And naming this pattern is not the same as being told your pain was never real. This channel exists to sit with exactly these kinds of quiet, unspoken psychological patterns, the ones that shape a life from underneath, without ever announcing themselves by name. If that is the kind of exploration you are drawn to, consider staying. There is more of this ahead. There is no clean resolution to offer here, no simple instruction for releasing an identity that once kept you safe. What Jung, Horney and Branden all seem to circle in their different languages is simply this: the story of what happened to you can be entirely true and still not be the only true thing about you. Whether that distinction changes anything for you is not a question this video can answer. If any part of this reached something in you, say so in the comments. Not the details of what happened, if you are not ready for that, but simply whether the identity felt more familiar than the event itself. And if you know someone who has spent years defending a story that has stopped serving them, this might be the first time anyone has ever offered them permission to ask what else might be true.